Many of you have met Kristin Kumpf already, those of you who were with us this weekend at the retreat, but we are just really excited to have her here this morning to share in our message. For those of you who weren't at our retreat, Kristin is a good friend of mine. We met many years ago at a training that she helped lead for my 2 years of service, and we just a great friend since then. And Kristin works for our board of church and society around community organizing. And so we've been really blessed to have her with us this weekend, and we are excited for the message that God has given her this morning. So will you welcome her?
Great. Thank you, Chelsea. And first, let me just say thanks to everyone that I got to meet this weekend. What an extraordinary gift to be invited to be with the St. Matthew's community, to meet over 60 of you who committed to journeying together throughout this weekend from Friday night through a long day yesterday in the midst of a thunderstorm and a fire alarm and all sorts of other lights out dramas. It was an extraordinary day. The Spirit was on the move for sure. And so it is a gift to complete this weekend by being with you this morning. So would you just join me in prayer? God, creator and sustainer of all of us, Jesus, our friend, our brother, our Savior, Holy Spirit, come. Be with us this morning as we enter into this Lenten journey, as we prepare ourselves for the days to come, as we seek to understand who you are in this world, God, and how you are calling us to be your hands and feet on this earth. We ask that all the words that I share be of you this morning, that you would crack open our hearts, our souls, our minds, our ears, our bodies, that we would experience you in a new way this morning and find ourselves surprisingly transformed in new ways. We ask all this in your name. Amen. So as we are about to enter into this time of Lent that Chelsea so beautifully described for our children, it is interesting that we have this extraordinary story of the Transfiguration this morning. And the Transfiguration is an interesting story for many reasons for me. So I'm a pastor's kid from West Ohio, from the United Methodist Church in West Ohio. My dad is now retired clergy there. And growing up, I was a part of many different churches, but I remember the church from my childhood specifically because of the giant stained glass window that showed the Transfiguration. It was one of those windows that maybe many of you saw in your old churches, where it was a giant picture of Jesus surrounded by Moses and Elijah on either side, and the disciples in all sorts of very strange positions. So what I remember specifically about this stained glass window is that there was one disciple who sort of looked like something out of a horror film, sort of shocked and falling back and afraid, and another disciple who literally had his hands over his face and his head, hiding. And I thought, what an interesting picture, that you have this beautiful image of Jesus, this very pristine, calm image of Jesus with this light, and yet this sense of the people around Jesus in this picture having some really bizarre emotional experiences. And I've always wondered what that meant. Why is the Transfiguration so important that there would be giant stained glass windows around the world in Christian churches of all sorts and kinds dedicated to this event? The interesting thing is that when we look at what the Transfiguration has meant historically in the church, there are many, many Christian scholars who name the Transfiguration as one of the 5 most important major milestones of the gospel narrative of the life of Jesus. Now, what's interesting about this is that the other 4 sort of bookend Jesus' life. So the first being the baptism, and the final 3 being crucifixion, resurrection, and ascension. So that's interesting, right? If we're looking at major milestones that Christian scholars are agreeing on, what does it mean? But the only one that's sort of in the middle-ish is the Transfiguration. So why was that so important? Why, as Thomas Aquinas called it, was the Transfiguration one of the greatest miracles that we see in the Gospels? For me, when I look at that, and one of the things I want us to look at today is not only what did the Transfiguration mean for Jesus and for the disciples, But what are some of the lessons from the Transfiguration that I think are really important for us on our journeys today, and for you all as St. Matthews, as you continue the journey that you have been on all of these years and all the years to come? For me, when I start to think about a journey, it's important to look at where we started from and where we've just come from. So similarly, I want us to start looking at the Transfiguration story this morning by thinking about what has just happened. So in the beginning of this chapter, the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 17, it literally starts with an interesting time definition. 6 days later. Well, that's interesting. That's an interesting way to sort of start one of the most major stories in the life of Jesus. So instantly I think, okay, well, what happened 6 days before? What happened in those 6 days after what happened before? So if we look back at chapter 16 in Matthew, we learn that Jesus has had a really hard couple weeks. This is a really challenging moment in Jesus' ministry. Jesus continues to be tested by the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They have literally called him out, asked him to show him a miracle of what heaven is, understanding heaven. And not just the Pharisees and Sadducees, Jesus and Peter are having a problem. They have had an interesting back and forth to the point where there was a moment where Jesus actually asked, and asking his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" Peter said the right thing. Peter stepped up and said, "I know that you are the Messiah." But right after that, we see Peter being Peter. There's so much to unpack about Peter. But in the midst of Jesus foreshadowing what's going to happen for him, looking ahead to say, I'm going to have to walk this hard path. I'm going to go to Jerusalem. I'm going to be killed. And there are some very hard things that are going to happen in this ministry. And Peter, and this is interesting because multiple versions of the Bible literally use the word rebuke. Peter rebukes Jesus, which is a fascinating dynamic when you think about one of the major disciples rebuking his leader. So Peter rebukes Jesus and says, Jesus, this can't happen. We can't have that. And Jesus shuts down Peter and not only calls Peter out, but says, you are a stumbling block in my ministry. Now that is an interesting dynamic that has just happened right before suddenly we see Jesus choosing to go up the mountain. Now we know what the mountain means throughout the Bible, right? We see multiple stories of what it means for people to go up the mountain. In fact, we heard one read beautifully this morning, an early mountain experience of Moses going up Mount Sinai, of having this moment of understanding where God is calling all of God's people, and realizing Moses is going to have the 10 Commandments, one of the guiding pieces for the people at the moment of what is the direction that God wants us to go. So we see Moses up Mount Sinai having this experience of God. Later, we see multiple experiences of Elijah also having experiences with God on the mountaintop. And literally in one of those moments, one of my favorite passages from the Old Testament, Elijah literally has an experience where God says, Elijah, what are you doing? What are you doing? And it is almost a call out of Elijah to literally get a grip on his journey and his ministry. And literally the language that is used in there is that Elijah hears God's still small voice. So we know that the mountaintop has been throughout history, throughout the Bible, and even until the present day, a place for God's people to experience God. A place where we are able to go, to get away, and to find the revelation that God wants us to find. And so I almost wonder if Jesus had hit this point in his ministry where he needed to get up to that mountaintop. Two chapters prior, the last time Jesus had tried to get up the mountain was the time when all of a sudden the crowds followed him and he had to perform the miracle of the loaves and fishes. He's surrounded by people constantly in this space. And so what did it mean for now Jesus, in a moment where he has been tested even by the people closest to him, to say, I need to get up the mountain. I need to experience God. That makes me think that part of the miracle of the Transfiguration, it was not just for the disciples in the way that we see in our stained glass windows. That maybe part of the miracle was that the Transfiguration really was for Jesus. Also, Jesus needed to experience God. When I think about us today, when I think about the ways that we are called to the mountain, the ways we need to experience revelations from God, I think about the bold decision of this church, St. Matthew's, in deciding to hold a visioning retreat this weekend. That was bold, I think, for many reasons. It is not always that we can ask people to commit a whole weekend of their lives, Friday and all day Saturday. It's bold because I know that this church has had many vision retreats over the years, and I know that has often left people feeling like, why are we doing this again? What's going to change? What is actually going to happen in this moment that will be a new revelation from God that will lead us to a new place? Is it even worth going up the mountain? And so I am grateful that this weekend you all chose to do that over 60 of you decided to come up that mountaintop, to break for a minute, to have a chance to hear from each other, to celebrate all that has been happening in this church. We heard celebrations, friends, of all the way back to the 1960s, over the years of what it has meant for you all to be a family, for you all to be community for each other. People literally used words like, this church has stepped up for me in the hardest moments of my life. This church has saved me. This church has been a place where I could raise my children, where children and youth and adults can be involved in extraordinary music ministry. That you have been engaged in over 126 missions around the world. That's extraordinary. And so in the midst of that mountaintop experience, in the same way that I think that was the moment for Jesus and the disciples, what do we need to be open to in order to experience the revelation from God? Because it's not just enough to go up to the mountain, friends. It wasn't just enough to show up at the retreat. But what does it mean to be open to hearing the still small voice of God speaking to us today? Again, I think we can look at what happened for Jesus in that moment of transfiguration. Now, transfiguration is a fascinating word to unpack. Again, as a kid looking at the stained glass window, I wasn't quite sure what that meant or why that was important until we start to unpack it, right? Transfiguration literally means a change in physical or spiritual appearance, or transformation. Now, transformation is an interesting word that I can really get around, partly because the word transformation is super important for those of us who call ourselves United Methodists. That embedded in the mission statement of the Global United Methodist Church, a mission statement that I have used in trainings around the world with people in Liberia, with people in Honduras, with people across this country in small rural villages and towns in Nebraska and other places, that I have experienced this real desire to understand what it means actually to look at this word, transformation, given that our Methodist mission statement is to be the disciples and make the disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. That being Methodist is about being the lived body and hands and feet of Jesus, but it's for something, friends. It is for the transformation of the world. And recently, I had one of the greatest joys of my job, and in addition to getting to train Methodists around the world, is I get to do a lot of work with young people. And so as Chelsea mentioned, one of the ways that Chelsea and I connected early on is this extraordinary program in the Global Methodist Church. And for the young people in this room, y'all should totally think about this as you're getting older, but it's called the Global Mission Fellows Program. And it is young people from around the world who gather together to serve for a couple years of service, either in their home country or another country around the world. This last year, when I was training the Global Mission Fellows, as I often do, I did this training on transformation. If we are going to unpack the mission statement of the Methodist Church, what does transformation mean to you? And as those of you who are at the retreat know, I love little sticky notes. And so we had all of the folks writing up sticky notes, clustering them across a whole wall to try and come up with themes of what does it mean to be transformed. And this is what they came up with, friends. These are young people. I think they were from 18 different countries around the world, and this is what they came up with. Transformation means moving from the old to the new. It means restoration and change. It means freedom. It means building relationships and people being together. It means taking action. That is an extraordinary, extraordinary definition, especially when we think about what happened for Jesus. If Jesus literally, in this hard point in his ministry, as he's driving towards the final piece that we're going to watch Jesus go throughout Lent, did Jesus need this moment of transformation, of restoration, of freedom, and ultimately of relationship with God and maybe even with those disciples that he brought up the mountain with him? And when I think about Jesus being transformed, something that is extraordinary to me is when I look at the message, which is a different version than we often hear in our churches of the gospel. The message literally says, Jesus' appearance changed from the inside out, right before their eyes. Sunlight poured from his face, and his clothes were filled with light. Jesus' appearance changed from the inside out. So what does that mean to be changed from the inside out? Are we willing to allow ourselves to be changed in that way? For me, one of the most extraordinary moments of the retreat this weekend is after we had moved through a time of celebration and a time of confession, looking at the really hard places where we haven't always stepped up as the church, as St. Matthew's, I asked the community to go with me through a vision exercise, to literally close their eyes and to imagine that you were walking in the doors of St. Matthew's a year from now, the end of February 2018, and to literally picture yourself walking into this space, into this sanctuary. What do you want to see worship like that day? Well, who are the people around you in the pews? What does it mean to walk out these doors and go into mission a year from now? What does it mean to sit in a small group and be gathered with other people? Who's there? What are the conversations you want to have? What's the experience you want to have? And at the end of this exercise, I said, we are gathered together for a celebration, some sort of good potluck, because of course we're Methodists with food. And what does it mean in that moment that you are asked, someone asks you, what has been your greatest joy? What has been the thing that has given you the most life this year in St. Matthew's? If someone were to ask you that right now, what do you think you would say? And what would you like to say if someone were to ask you, if it were now today, February the 26th, 2018, what do you want your greatest joy in the life of your life here at St. Matthew's to be? What do you hope that will be a year from now? But the gift to me, friends, was watching you all in that room do that exercise. Because when I looked around the room, I saw transfiguration. I literally saw the light of Jesus coming up from the inside out on your faces. I wish you could have seen your faces in that moment. And for me, that is the gift, my friends. That is the gift, is are we willing to go up the mountain and to go up the mountain together, to bring the people along with us that we need to bring, to be open to the revelation of God, and actually experience then that transformation from the inside out. But the story didn't end there. Perhaps for me, the most extraordinary part of the miracle of the transfiguration was what happened after this moment happened. Is that bless Peter for always showing up and doing the things that we might do, right? So Peter, in this moment of total awe and excitement and joy, wants to step up and do the right thing for Jesus. So Peter says, Lord, it's great to be up here. If you want, I could just make us 3 dwellings. We'll have one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. Interesting side note, none for him and the other disciples. So I think that's interesting. They're just gonna be out in the cold, but he's willing to make the dwellings for the 3 main characters of this miracle. And in that moment, this is so interesting, a bright cloud overshadowed them. And they heard a voice say, "This is my son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. Now there's a lot going on right there, right? On the one hand, you have Peter, and Peter who, in its reference back to the Old Testament Feast of the Tabernacles, which was where the Israelites came and dwelt for 7 days in these booths. So Peter is kind of pulling that up. He knows that is an excellent biblical example to offer, that he's going to build these booths for Jesus. We're going to stay up here because this is the place to stay. Don't we all want to stay on the mountaintop? When we find the good stuff, isn't it good to stay? But what's interesting is that God and Jesus literally stop that before it can even get started. Literally, while Peter is still speaking, the cloud overshadows him. And when Peter and the disciples hear God say, "This is my son, my beloved," listen to him. Now, often you will hear sermons about the Transfiguration focusing on the awe of the disciples. And I think that was totally true. I think the disciples were in awe. They were blown away. I think part of their fear came from that, from the extraordinary experience of the light and God and hearing these voices and seeing these prophets that have been their heroes suddenly appear. But I also think part of the fear came from shame. Because if you think about the fact that just a few days ago, Peter rebuked Jesus. Let me just say that again. Peter is rebuking Jesus, clearly not listening to him, clearly struggling with this moment of fear of where they're going. He knows they're going to Jerusalem. If he's really listening to his heart and his soul, he knows Jesus is right. He knows the ministry is going to get harder. He knows that they're going to be called on to do some really extraordinary things. But here's what it takes, friends, for him to not only decide, okay, we got to get off this mountain, but to go out in the world and do what needs to be done to complete this journey that we're going to watch through Lent. Is he needed to hear God's reminder that not only is Jesus beloved, but that belovedness extends to all of us. And the way that he knew that is the next thing that happens is Jesus came and touched them. Jesus came and touched them and said, "Get up, don't be afraid." That, friends, that moment, for me, is the big realization of what it means to go to the mountaintop, to be open to being transformed, but knowing that the story doesn't end there. That what are we called to do as the people who are God's disciples today, as the disciples of St. Matthew's, to take what you experienced, for those of you who experienced the retreat this weekend, and for all of us who are here this morning, what does it mean to remember that we are God's beloved and feel the touch of Jesus that is calling us to push through the fear in a way that we can go back down the mountain? I deeply resonate and struggle with that because I realized my own transfiguration of my ministry also happened on a mountain. I was serving in the same program that Chelsea was in, the Global Mission Fellows Program. And I had been sent to the Philippines, which was a fascinating journey for me because I spoke Spanish and I fully expected to be sent to Latin America. And when I was told that I would understand Tagalog, not really hardly at all, I would be fine with Tagalog because there was some Spanish in it, I was not 100% convinced. My journey in the Philippines led me to work with indigenous communities who had been slowly moved off of their land. As international corporations were coming in, mining corporations were sort of buying up the land around them, and the people had to move. And so you had a lot of indigenous communities in pain, a lot of communities not sure where they could go, what land was theirs, what it meant to be in that land, and you had a church struggling with how to respond. And so my entire experience of living in the Philippines was literally hiking up mountains, meeting with communities, and looking at what it meant to go back down and work together so that everyone could survive in the healthiest way possible. And my own transformation happened because one of those times I was going up a mountain. We had reached a community. It was an extraordinary experience. And we realized that they didn't have the food to feed us and we needed to get off the mountain immediately. That we needed to get down, which meant hiking down in the dark, in the rain, in a rainforest with leeches. That was not my ideal dream of ministry. So suddenly we find ourselves in this attempt to go down the mountain, which actually really meant going over 3 or 4 other mountains. And I literally had one of the hardest fights I have ever had with God. I literally remember saying in my mind, "God, this is not what you called me for. I have no idea why you sent me to the Philippines. Why am I a United Methodist? What are you doing in this world? I don't understand what it means to be people who are displaced off their land, and why am I caught up in this?" And right about the time that I was having this extraordinary fight with God, 2 things happened. One of the leaders of the community reached out and touched me. At that point, part of the reason I was having the fight with God is I was trying to walk across a chasm on a slippery log, knowing that I had failed the balance beam in gym and I was probably going to fall off. But in that moment, it was like the hand of God reached out and grabbed me and pulled me across. And that hand did not let go of me until finally, hours later, we reached this village. And it was like something out of a movie or something that you see these twinkling lights. And I realized they were the oil lamps coming off of the village. And this is a village, again, about 3 or 4 mountain passes over on our way attempting to get off the mountain. And as I came up to the village and I sort of sat down at the first hut that we came to, and I looked down and my legs were covered in leeches. I still have the scars today. And I was so overwhelmed by that experience that I didn't even know what to do. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to leave. I wanted to just stay. And so one of the men came over and started literally pulling with banana leaves the leeches off of my legs and washing my legs and feet. And I remember saying to him, it's okay, I can just do it. I'll just do it myself. And he said, no, Kristin, this is what it means to be in community. We care for each other even when it's messy. And that was an extraordinary lesson for me. And a lesson for me of that's right. We do ministry with and for each other even when it's messy. And so by God, I was not going to leave that village because this is where I found that gift. And yet I remember that leader saying to me, Kristin, no, you are, and he used a word that I'd never heard anyone use before. Instead of the usual word that people used for white people there, the word in their language for someone like me was people who come up the mountain and go back down. He said, you are one of those special people who have come to see us where we are, but it is not your job to stay here. You need to go back down. You need to work with our people on the ground back in the local communities. So that, friends, was my lesson of that it is not only extraordinary to show up and let ourselves be transfigured and transformed by God, but the call for us is to go back down. We are called to go back out into the messy places, to the places in our church where sometimes maybe we have hurt each other, to the places in our community where we have not yet invited people, where we have not yet been in mission with our neighbors, to the places that we may not even dreamed of where God could be leading us to go. This passage ends with Jesus saying, don't share the vision until I've been raised from the dead. That's always really struck me as a bizarre way to end this beautiful miracle story. But what several scholars have said is that is Jesus' way of ensuring that the story gets told because it will be most understood when it's understood with the gift of the resurrection. And so, friends, I ask you this question. Again, for those of you who are at the retreat, what is the story you want to tell from this weekend? In what ways were you transformed this weekend? How can you share that with the other people in this church and with people in the community in the world? And for the rest of us who weren't here this weekend, in what ways do you want to experience the love and the transformation of God? How do we find God and in the gift that we have, especially in front of us in the weeks to come? We're about to enter into this journey of Lent. What does it mean to know that God is with us on this journey? That God will meet us on the mountain? That when we see God on the mountain, we know that we can be transformed. And that in that transformation, we are called to go back out to the world. Let us make sure that we are opening up our hearts, our lives, our experiences for all that God has for us. And friends, my prayer for you this morning is that you at St. Matthew's will be a community that knows you are called to be together, to go up the mountain, to experience the transformation, and to come back down into the hard places. Blessings.